Start na. Good morning to our friends in Europe. Good afternoon and good evening to our friends in Asia. I'm Trisha P. Octaviano from the Governance and Economy Department of the Asia-Europe Foundation. Welcome to the fourth episode in our series of webinars under the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training. The ASEF Public Diplomacy Training is a long-running project that has been supported by the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. The project is also in collaboration with the Diplo Foundation. Today's webinar is about public diplomacy and discourse in the age of algorithms. We will tackle the socio-political and ethical issues surrounding internet algorithms and their implications for public life. You can join the discussion in three ways. One, scan the QR code that appears on the screen and respond to our poll. You can also click the link shared with you through the chat box on YouTube. Two, ask your questions to our panel of experts through the YouTube live chat. And three, post about your thoughts on the webinar on social media, and please use #ASEFPDT and ASEF Public Diplomacy. Joining us in this conversation are four distinguished speakers: Dr. Damon Spry, Mr. Sisla Sumant, Dr. Shoba Avadhani, and Dr. Cornelio Biola. Please allow me to briefly introduce them. Dr. Damon Spry is a lecturer in media and communications at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on social media impacts on politics and diplomacy. He is a regular contributor to think tanks and has consulted for several multinational companies, NGOs, and governments. Mr. Sisla Sumant is currently serving as the head of digital sales at Restaurant Brands International, APAC. And prior to this, Sisla worked at Dynamic Yield to drive personalization and optimization for APAC's largest e-commerce companies through the use of AI and machine learning algorithms. Dr. Shoba Avadhani is a lecturer at the Department of Communications and New Media at the National University of Singapore, where she teaches modules on digital media culture, critical media studies, and public speaking. With research interests in the areas of political communication, the politics of technology and education, and media literacy and citizenship, she has published research on the intersection of youth citizenship and new media. And Dr. Cornelio Biola is Associate Professor in Diplomatic Studies at the University of Oxford and head of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. He has published extensively on issues related to the impact of digital technology on the conduct of diplomacy, with a recent focus on public diplomacy, international negotiations, and methods for countering digital propaganda. Our expert panel will be moderated by Dr. Jovan Kurbalia. He has been a longtime friend of the Asia-Europe Foundation. He is the executive director of Diplo Foundation and head of the Geneva Internet Platform. He has been a pioneer in the field of cyber diplomacy since 1992, when he established the Unit for Information Technology and Diplomacy at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies in Malta, and later Diplo Foundation. With no further ado, I give the floor to our dear friend, Jovan. Jovan, take the floor and let's begin this conversation.
Thank you, Tricia. It's really great to join you today. And you worried me when you told that I started it in 1992. It was in the last century. But the good news is that many things has changed in terms of technology, but we have a continuity in terms of the core functions of diplomacy. And I think this interplay between continuity of the core functions of diplomacy in general and public diplomacy in particular, and change in technology will be underlying canvas or backbone of our discussion today. How to adjust this core function of diplomacy to the latest changes, brought in this case by rise of digital platforms and algorithms behind digital platforms. This is the overall context. discussion in, well, 45 minutes, hopefully we'll have a deeper understanding of interplay between AI and algorithms and public diplomacy, and also deeper understanding what we as academics, diplomats, journalists, tech specialists can do in order to make algorithms and digital platform as a source for good and also force for good in terms of increasing understanding in the world, especially in the case of our host today between Asia and Europe. Also increasing the deeper understanding of the issues and readiness for people to negotiate and make compromises in positive sense, which is the underlying modus operandi of good and functional diplomacy. This is the overall context. But without further ado, I would like to see what is the result of our survey and what is the background of the audience when it comes to algorithm. Do we have many top experts as I hope, and how far we are with the knowledge about algorithms? Okay, let's say 9% of you have some experience with algorithms. It would be good to hear later on what is that experience. 18% I have little experience with algorithm, and we have a majority who are newbies in this field, and it seems that we have a big diplomatic community attending this session. Tech community is a relative minority. This is an excellent news because we start from the same basics, and we can build the knowledge and the understanding in this short journey of about 1 hour, but the start of longer journey on AI, algorithms, and diplomacy. Therefore, without further ado, I would like to go deep into our discussion and have the first round of questions for our really prominent panel. And the first round of questions is around basics in algorithm. What are internet algorithms? Why do they matter? And in what ways do algorithms shape and influence our everyday lives? We start from, well, whatever, 20,000 feet, and then we move in as we walk through the panel, we move closer to the question of public diplomacy and algorithms. Let us start with our panelist, Damien. You're next to me virtually, at least, although you're in Australia. Could you just kick off with a few short reflections around these 3 questions? Then we move forward to other panelists. Over to you.
Thanks, Jovan, and welcome everyone. I'll start off by directly addressing this question of what is an algorithm, and it's basically a list of instructions. So maybe others will get into some more complex definitions of that, but I want to speak specifically to what algorithms do on social media and why that might be important for you if you're using social media as part of public diplomacy. So basically, algorithms are designed to do 3 things. They're designed to encourage growth of a social platform. In other words, increase the numbers of people who are using that platform. Secondly, increase the amount of engagement. So in other words, people using that platform, either creating content, sharing content, or commenting on content, or otherwise interacting with it by liking or using other emoticons or those sorts of things. And then the third thing that the algorithms do on social media, and it's often overlooked when we talk about this, is they target advertising on social media. So the way that advertising, social media platforms are designed to make money through advertising, and the algorithm is a key aspect of how platforms make money and therefore how they continue to operate. And I'll make just 2 other quick things about advertising if I can before I switch over to someone else, because algorithmically, what the algorithm is doing when it's engaged in what's called targeted advertising is it is 1, targeting, and secondly, testing. So it's targeting those people who are the most likely, who are going to be engaged with a type of content, likely consumers. And then it's testing possible content. So what that does is it tests that not only the product or the service that's being advertised, but also the type of content that it's offering and the design of that content. And then it learns and repeats, learns and repeats, learns and repeats. And those two aspects of how social media algorithms are essential to understanding what can and can't be done when you're using social media. I'll leave it there for now because we've got a lot to talk about for the next hour or so. So I don't want to use up all my tidbits right away.
Thank you. Thank you, Damien, for really this bullet points summary of what is done by algorithm and setting the stage for interplay between digital platforms and algorithm. Let's see what's going on under the bonnet. Sisla, what could you tell us about internet algorithms and this, some of the, how it works in technological context, what just Damien explained as the main functions. Over to you.
Thank you. So I think I come with more of an experience of these algorithms in action, the interplay of industry and the technical piece, right? So in my experience, the internet algorithms are generally used to influence people in a few different ways, right? The first one being for organizations to increase their understanding of the customer or their target customers as they navigate through these digital touch points, things like the website or a mobile app, or if you're walking into, let's say, a restaurant, or if you're walking into an IKEA, for example, understanding your behavior and trying to extrapolate information and behavior about you as such. Secondly, the usage is around segmentation, right? Learning about user behavior and on-site data to create a unified profile of this person, to understand how they're going to be engaging today, but predicting their behavior in the future, so you can influence those decisions. This perfectly segues into my third point, which is the prediction of customer preferences. One thing that I'm sure all of us have seen at some point is if you go to an e-commerce website, you might go into a certain page and you see products that say, or a recommendation carousel, right? That allows you to look at recommended products and pick those items up and purchase them. So that's, using the predictive capabilities of algorithms, right? And then in tune with prediction is predicting customer intent, right? So using past data, past behavioral patterns, algorithms can actually predict intent and can be tied in to the digital strategy of the organization. And then finally, there's a temporal aspect, right? I think there's an evolution of these algorithms over time that's fed by this guest behavior or the customer behavior on these sites, and projecting their behavior into the future, and seeing how they can be monetized and their behavior can be monetized over time.
Thank you, Sisla. I'm really a fortunate moderator with such to the point and short interventions by our presenters. Sisla, while you were talking, and you and Damien, I thought of one just question that we may put it at the sort of a drawing board of our discussion. Did AI predict pandemics? And how AI can do with the so-called black swans, which Damien is joining from Australia, and Nassim Taleb wrote about those things that cannot be predicted. Later on, we may just in discussion reflect on that also in the views from our presenters. But we are now getting from the purpose, from the view from the commercial sector to Shobha, who is the researcher on the social culture and overall impact of the social media and algorithms in particular. Shobha, the floor is yours. Just unmute, please.
Yes, I've done that, sorry. Yes, so I mean, everyone has raised very interesting points, and I'm going to say that this question of how algorithms shape our everyday lives may have to be answered, below the usual level of consideration. So I want to introduce the notion that we can ask actually more questions about what algorithms are, because they emerge from and further make up the kind of culture that we exist in, So algorithms are actually built on relations that have been present for a long time. So in this case, for example, we have this notion of algorithmic culture, right? That a movie recommender, for example, an algorithm that recommends movies for people on Netflix is cultural because it shapes flows of cultural material, right? Not because the algorithmic logics are themselves cultural. So we can think about how the news we see on social media, for example, the way the algorithms on Facebook actually construct our cultural worldview through what it shows to us, right? We also know, from the research that algorithms can become culture. So, if we think about how fans can launch a listening campaign to influence a music recommender, let's say, so, this question of what algorithms are is something that actually it's looked at in different ways by different people, so there isn't actually one definition of what algorithm is. I'm not talking about the technological field here, but I'm saying in public discourse, when we are talking about algorithms as a kind of social entity and a problem, the question of what algorithms are is something that different people are talking about very differently, So if we think about the fact that, for example, condensed visual messages get the most traction on social media, let's say, then it leads us to think about what is the information that we are not getting. I do want to also say that the idea of what people put online, right? So algorithms don't only structure what we see, they can also structure what we are creating. So if we think in terms of nations, and we think in terms of nations as imagined communities, then the sorts of tweets that people can produce around the idea of what is their country can actually enact nationalism in a particular kind of way. So then, if we think about how people are tweeting, if we think about the kinds of hashtags or the trending topics that come up that make people think about what kind of discourse do I want to create with my tweet, we can actually see that algorithms are doing a lot of work in helping to construct national identity, helping to craft a particular kind of culture, and actually helping to structure the ways in which we think of ourselves as human beings. Like Damien said just now, I could say more about this, but I think I'll hold back for now.
Thank you, Shobha, for bringing the element of cultural diplomacy and deeper understanding in our discussion. And it is particularly relevant for Asia-Europe context. I still remember that when we ran the workshop, when we started this public diplomacy project 5 or 6 years ago, discussions were going towards the question of cultural diplomacy, how the culture can be a bridge between two regions, with all differences and diversity. Now, what you brought is the question of a third actor. In addition to traditional Asian and European cultures, we have now algorithm. Is it unifying? Is it diversifying aspect? And thank you for bringing this aspect. Now, Cornelio, we have all sort of ingredients for lovely meal. We have Damien's input, setting the stage on social media, Sisla bringing the economic perspective, Shobha bringing the cultural understanding. And what would be this meal that you will prepare for the first round, bringing together diplomacy and algorithms? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jovan. Just building on what my fellow panelists mentioned, I think I'm thinking about an algorithm exactly as a set of codes of instructions that try to understand and predict what we like where we are on social media. And why do I say so? Because probably, I mean, it's been discussed that the greatest invention in the digital age is just that little button, like. The study in 2013 said that 300 likes are enough for the algorithm to learn something about you better than your spouse. So that type of information that is being collected is particularly important in order to understand how algorithm shapes our lives. So one particular ingredient that I like to highlight is speed. So what happens with the algorithm, it speeds up our communication. So at the moment, the algorithm, because of the sheer amount of information that is being circulated, just think about it, it's about 9,000 tweets per second, or about 2,500 Facebook shares per second. So in order to manage that type of information, the algorithm creates a particular way in which we see information. So the question of visibility, what we see and what we don't see, and the time frame in which we see this kind of information shapes a lot about how we consume information. To give you an example, for instance, on Twitter, a post in terms of lifespan, and by lifespan I mean the duration for a content, for a post to reach about 50% of its total interactions. So on Twitter, it's about 18 minutes. So 18 minutes, if you post something, if this is the time, the duration for which you can actually expect, the mass amount of interaction with the public. Facebook is about 5 hours, Instagram is about 20 hours. But I think what it's important to take from this is the fact that the communication is very fast. And we have to be aware, especially when we think about public diplomacy and trying to engage with foreign audience, how much of what we say or how much we try to communicate actually reaches the public that we want to reach. There are different ways to deal with this problem, but I don't know whether this is the time or maybe we can discuss later. But I think this is the speed of communication is probably one particular aspect that comes from the way in which algorithms have been set up and try to facilitate this engagement of us on social media.
Thank you, Cornelio. I just brought from my image database one illustration of very pertinent point that you made. What's happened in 60 seconds as we are discussing on the internet with number of tweets, with the speed, and that element of the speed. Therefore, so far, our meal or what we are cooking today is fast food. Now we'll see if we are going to make it a bit slower later on. Let me just bring together all of these threads in our discussion. Social media and the impact of a platform by Damien. Sisla bringing commercial aspects. Shoba adding the question of cultural dimension. Cornelio focusing on the question of speed and impact, and also giving a bit of definition of algorithm. And I'm thankful that we didn't go very deep into definition. It was just nice that Cornelio mentioned that it is a code. It is basically discovering patterns out of the huge amount of data and trying to predict the future. Now we have all ingredients. We have now dilemma on this journey if we are going to make fast food or slow food, pasta or tofu or excellent Asian food. Should we add a bit of curry? And what would be the sort of taste of meal that we are preparing together? Now let me add a bit of complexity now on this point with the second round of questions, building on this initial thought. The second round of questions are the following. What are the unintended consequences of digital platforms that aggregate information on diplomatic practice, on the conduct of foreign policy, or the daily decision that we make? All of us, following now elections in the United States, are very familiar with the power of the misuse of potential distortion of reality through the use of social media. What we can say about diplomacy, and let's go in the opposite direction and start with Cornelio, who has been bringing this bridge between algorithms and diplomacy. Cornelio, what are your worries about use of algorithms in public diplomacy, and what are the unintended consequences? Over to you.
Thank you very much again, Jovan. I think one issue that has come up and we've seen in the past probably 5 or 6 years is how important emotional framing is on social media. We have to remember, and as my fellow panelists mentioned before, algorithms are built to privilege engaging posts. So they favor engagement because engagement brings, facilitates ads, So nothing proves more engaging than strong emotions. And we had studies looking at the role of emotion on social media. And there are 2 emotions in particular that travel well online. Usually people look at emotions based on 2, sometimes 3 dimensions. but let's stick with two. One is valence. Valence means positive or negative emotion. Joy is something that you like. It's a positive dimension. Anger, it's a negative. It's something that, both of them are very powerful. And the second element, when we think about emotions, it's also the fact that they are energizing. There is something about the arousal level of the emotion. So these two emotions, joy and anger, travel the best on social media. The interesting aspect is anger travels 6 times faster than joy, according to some studies. So why is that important? Because it creates an environment in which it facilitates the emotional framing. Messages have to be framed in order to catch the attention of the public, in order to facilitate this kind of engagement. The thing that worries, and I think is particularly important for public diplomacy in terms of unintended consequences, is the fact that the way in which you frame your message, it is exactly the type of audience that you are going to attract, the type of followership that is going to come with you. So if you frame your emotions in a negative way, that's the crowd that is likely to come and listen to you. So for a diplomat, you want to stay away from that, right? So how to frame these emotions in a positive way, in a way that actually creates bridges, not division, it's something that we're still trying to learn. So what I wanted to highlight, in addition to the speed problem that I mentioned before, it's the dominant role of emotion in digital communication.
Thank you, Cornelio. We have culture, we have now emotions, and this meal is becoming really rich. And thank you for bringing this point. And probably one reflection for our audience. I hope they're not getting angry at us, because the discussion is very dynamic, and I hope they have a joy. But one question is, a lot of discussion of public diplomacy usually starts with our rationality, sometimes moves to the heart, our values, but rarely goes into what Aristotle called pathos, into our stomach. What are the emotional aspects which Cornelius such eloquently brought into our discussion? And one question, another for the audience is, can we control our emotional messages? When we send them, do we know what the reaction would be? Very rich meal in making. Shoba, can we control our message, and what are the other unintended consequences? You already sketched a few of them in your introduction.
Thank you, Jovan. So I definitely do think that emotion is a big part of this. And I think that is, I don't know how far it's an unintended consequence. So this is what some people have referred to as platform capitalism or digital capitalism, right? Which actually public scholars and intellectuals such as Evgeny Morozov, have said that this is the real issue when it comes to the ways in which algorithms have impacted public discourse, right? Which is that ultimately, when it comes to digital capitalism, information is a commodity. So the moment information becomes a commodity, it becomes something up for sale, and it becomes about maximizing the profit margin. So you are more interested in clicks and likes than you are in really the quality of public discourse, right? So what we see happening here then is that more and more emotions become commoditized, right? As you have these algorithms coming in. So that's why I always want to say that the issue is not specifically algorithms, but the sorts of systems that they occur within, right? So if we think about this platform capitalism, right? Platforms actually introduce new layers of opacity into every facet of social life, so that things that once belonged in the public domain now become hidden behind some of these layers, because it's so hard to figure out not only how algorithms work, but how are they being used, So just as an example, right, if we think about how people find a mate, right? It used to be in neighborhood bars, and now it's moved to dating apps, right? So then the sorts of processes that form families move behind the velvet rope of a platform. Right? When public education becomes online delivery, then teacher-student interactions go into privately controlled black boxes. So this is what some theorists have actually referred to, all right, as a black box society. It leads to a kind of black box society where we don't know how to unpack exactly what is happening. So that is how a lot of the research is we're trying to look into these things, but it is difficult. So my point, just to wrap up, right, in saying that I'm not sure that it is an unintended consequence of these technologies, right? I mean, that's what it was designed to do. But it is perhaps the transference of the commodity aspects of social media from the consumer segment to the political and the public segment, which I think is where some of the complications have arisen.
Thank you, Shobha, for questioning this notion of unintended consequences. I think it's highly relevant, bringing also to reality of many of us, like question of dating, which is very deep in cultural fabric of many societies worldwide, in particular in Asia. Therefore, are we basically deconstructing the centuries of the social practice and cultural practice, which could be of unintended consequences of public diplomacy? Okay, Sisla, we have now building blocks: emotion, cultural context, fabric of society. What can you add to this line of thinking on unintended consequences?
I think I'll bring my experience in the industry into the mix to drive the conversation forward a little bit. And in my experience, algorithms, typically in the usages that I've seen of them, capitalize on the idea of convenience and profit, right? And there's a lot of conversation going around in the tech industry around the inherent bias of algorithms, because algorithms are developed by human beings after all. Right. So the question is, within the industrial use of algorithms, how do those inherent biases bleed into these algorithms themselves, right? And thereby disenfranchising certain populations. And that fundamentally serves to erode the experience of a few disenfranchised populations within these digital platforms. And fundamentally, the goal of algorithms is to fit some of our preferences, but not all of them. Right? Algorithms try to understand us, but they have a limited set of data points, right? So they present almost a caricature of our tastes and preferences, which is then used by industry to make generalizations about what we want, whether it's, do we want to buy this specific sports shoe or that specific t-shirt? It has a limited set of data points, and it can be a bit myopic in the suggestions that we're shown. Because we can't capture every data point and represent the vastness of a person and their needs, wants or attitudes, I think it raises a few questions, right? What is the meaning behind capturing all of this information? How is it being used? And are we reduced to just a few sets of data points? And these are some of the questions that I have contended with myself. As I've been working with people in the past in the industry. You just have a blank profile of an individual. You know nothing of them, just based on, you just know their behavioral patterns. And it raises a few more questions, right? So around the idea of the black box, right? Who is fundamentally benefiting from the development of these algorithms? And how do we as consumers know how this information is being used? And what purposes, what's the means to the ends here, right? In my view, I think there is a lack of transparency, and the oversight generally is hidden from view because of the nature of the algorithms themselves. Not everyone has the foundational knowledge to understand what these algorithms do. And those who do know, it's proprietary information, so it's hidden from view.
Thank you, Sisla, bringing transparency issue, echo chamber. And you, while you were talking, you remind me of a great thinker of Asia from Calcutta, Amartya Sen, who wrote the book on identity, explaining that our identity is very, very diverse. I'm sure that our panelists can reflect a lot on that. Maybe in some of future discussion, his insights could be interesting. And his point was, we are very diverse in our identity. I'm now based in Switzerland in an empty hotel. I'm originally from the Balkans. I like to play table tennis, well, We can continue this list. I'm sure all of us can bring these elements, but we are very often, as you said, reduced to the few elements from our identity, and that's very, very tricky. Damien, what do you take from this, let's say, negative or risky aspects of the use of algorithm in social media and diplomacy? Over to you.
There you go. So I'm going to pick up that point about diversity and talk about some of the research that I have conducted, which is just which suggests very strongly that social media has different uses for public diplomats in very different parts of the world. It varies greatly depending upon where you are and therefore with whom you're seeking to speak. But I want to explain why before I get there. Something that I think Cornelia mentioned a way back was, one of the questions was, how do we get information to those whom we're seeking to communicate? And it turns out that social media oftentimes is a really bad way of doing that if you are a public diplomat. And this is because of all the things we've talked about, because of the way that the algorithms operate, information that we each see normally comes from people with whom we already have a close relationship. That's family and friends. The algorithm recognizes that close relationship already because we have sent them a message. We have commented on their post. We have shared their post. Sometimes that relationship might be antagonistic. I have crazy members of my family who I keep on getting into fights with on Facebook. I don't know why. It's sometimes maybe I shouldn't, but that is recognized as a close relationship. So I keep on seeing the information that appears from them. So what that means, and Mark Zuckerberg himself has described Facebook as it's not the town square, it's the digital lounge room. In other words, it's not a place where a great number of people of many different backgrounds can come together to learn things we didn't know, to discuss important matters of the day, to reach across borders and boundaries, to seek to find new ways of communicating and making the world a better place. Facebook's not very good at that. Neither are the other social media platforms. They are much better at, like Sherba mentioned, finding you a partner based upon, your cultural characteristics, your cultural preferences, and also your personal interactions that it's recognized already. Now, as I said, it's really bad, except when it's not. And in those parts of the world where social media has, in my research, been very useful, are countries that are smaller, poorer, and younger. All right, so for a country, and the other thing is closer. That's a little bit more complicated to explain. I'll get to that by explaining using an example. So for one country that I researched, my country, Australia, the place in which Facebook is most useful is Timor-Leste, which is a small, relatively poor and relatively young country. All right, it's also very close to Australia, not only geographically, but strategically. Australia is very involved there in terms of aid programs and those sorts of things. Now, I won't give you all the facts and figures about all the other countries that I've looked at, but basically I've looked at 140 Facebook pages all around the world by about 8 different ministries of foreign affairs in about 20 odd different locations. And places like Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, places like that always get a lot higher engagement than countries like the UK, Canada, France, and so forth. And if you think about it a little bit, it makes sense. Yeah? In Timor-Leste, people who are engaging with the Australian embassy, well, what are they engaging with? This gets back to this thing about emotional content, but a second thing, useful content. So they will engage with things that make them proud and happy, right? So when they hear a story of an East Timorese who's got a scholarship in Australia or has been doing great things, or has won a prize, or has just graduated from a military training program, that's the type of thing that gets shared. But also very practical stuff. Information about jobs, about funding, and so forth and so forth. So how do you get information to a population where you are faced with these difficulties, with this, you're combating these mountains, these torrents of content that, as Cornelia has said, is coming down so fast. How can you make sure that the people you need to get certain information are going to get that information? It's very simple. You just have to pay for it, all right? And you use target advertising to target those people in particular. And I'll give you another example of that. And it's a very straightforward, quite dull example, but it's kind of like an essential thing of what diplomats do. So there's a large Australian population in Hong Kong. The Australian consulate in Hong Kong manages the elections. Whenever there's an Australian election, all the Australians have to go down to the consulate to vote. How do they make sure that all the Australians in Hong Kong know how to vote? They send them, they target them using social media. They can target them by knowing their nationality, knowing that they're in Hong Kong, knowing their certain age, and a few other things. It's very easy to target them.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll sum that up by saying there's a big difference between using like organic content to try to get information out there to a broad spectrum of population, or paying for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Damien, also for making this nice bridge from the unintended consequences and negative side of social media to examples of the basically social media being a force for good. And I would like to introduce also as a bridge towards our last segment, the survey, our poll, and the poll goes in the following way. Now that you know how algorithms work, do you think the social media can still become a force of good? You have three answers. Yes, it can still become a force of good. No, I'm not optimistic. Third, neutral, I still have to think through it. Try to give the clear answer, not necessarily diplomatic neutral one, although we will understand, and we'll see how many diplomats we have in audience based on answers. Okay, it's time for a poll, and let's see what will be your reaction. And we got a few questions. One question which is very interesting, and I will make while we're waiting for the poll for our audience. Question is if diplomats will remain relevant. I argue that diplomacy will become increasingly important in interdependent world, but who will perform diplomacy will be changing. But there is a great hope for the future of the diplomatic profession, but that question can come later on in discussion. What is the result of the poll? Yes, yes, it can still become a force for good. Great, we have optimistic audience. We have a neutral 18%, and no, I'm not optimistic. And that's could be interesting to compare also for the origin of the colleagues who basically voted, because there is a very solid research that Asian communities and countries are more optimistic when it comes to the impact of technology on society, unlike European or American communities. That's probably one of the researchers, future researchers for Asia-Europe Foundation. Now, we are moving to the last segment in our discussion, and the last segment is basically answering the question, how should governments and society respond to these impacts, and what is the sort of solution or Swiss Army knife of solutions that can help us to have social media and algorithms as a force for good for society and diplomacy? Let's start from the center of our panel, from Sisla. Sisla, what would be your inputs to this, let's say, Swiss knife for algorithms and public diplomacy in making? What would be the tool that you would suggest? Technical or conceptual or business tool?
I think one of the foundations of all of this would be the education side of things. I think highlighting the importance or driving more people into STEM education, regardless of the direction they want to take in life, and kind of influencing people and engaging them through these STEM fields as early as possible, I think is important. I personally, for example, I'm no longer on social media because I have seen the types of information that it can capture, the data that it can capture. However, I know a lot of people that don't understand the implications of the types of data that they're giving away without really understanding what it is they're giving away, right? I think one of the things that from the government perspective that can be done is kind of educating people very early on the implications of algorithms and how they can shape your thinking in the future. So I think my view firmly is on the education side of things, because I can see a lack of education in these specific fields and understanding of these algorithms can really put you at the mercy of those, at corporations or those who want to influence your beliefs and views. So that would be my position today.
Thank you, Sisla. Education is the first tool: training, capacity building, awareness building. And I don't know, we will leave that question for the end. But is the solution to switch off your social media account as you did? That's probably the question for our audience and for panelists. Now we move to Shoba. Shoba, what would you add to this this toolkit?
So I have actually 3 points to raise over here. The first one is actually in response to Sisla's point. I absolutely agree that education is a big part of it, but I would go in the opposite direction. And I would say that we probably have too many people who are in the business of designing these algorithms, and not enough people who study ethics and, the humanities in order to deeply understand how problematic a lot of this work is. But in essence, we are probably in agreement, because what we are both thinking about is that increased awareness of that intersection between the technological and the ethical. I also think that, the idea of switching off social media, of course, not everyone is in a privileged position of being able to do that, So I want to say that in terms of how this can be addressed, there are no quick tweaks, right? First of all, but there are things that can be done. There are short-term and long-term kind of approaches that can be taken, and both are very important. So for the short term, of course, there are issues about regulation, and these need to be banged out, and they cannot be banged out as long as a lot of the tech corporations are powerful and influential lobbyists of governments all over the world. But having said that, some of the longer term issues have to do with ethics. What does it mean to have a set of ethics? And this is different from a code of like a moral kind of code. So the thing about algorithms is, because, the way in which they emerge, the way in which they are designed, the way in which they are implemented involves a lot of this black boxing along the way. And there's so much that is uncertain, so much that is unpredictable, ironically, along the way, that ethics has to be something that emerges on the spot, from these interactions. So it requires more intellectual engagement. But I have a third point here, and that I'm actually, there's a bit of research that I was delving into, which was done by a group of researchers in the US, and it was just published this year. They actually looked at this notion of how can we get complex stories, right? Because actually the thing about social media and the way algorithms work is that they have deeply polarized people, right? And they have polarized people by reducing complex narratives, so that a narrative around race, which is so complex, for example, becomes about X and Y. A narrative around gender, which is so complex, becomes a narrative around X and Y. And then what happens when you have something like intersectionality, which is where people may occupy multiple positions of oppression and marginality. Those are even more complex stories that seem to not get carried around. Nobody can figure out how to hear them, right? So many people don't hear these stories. So the research actually looked at the idea of a kind of networked solidarity and the notion of sort of community hacking of social media platforms. So what they actually found was that if you produced quality content, but after that actually worked with local communities, artists, scholars, activists, people whose names are trusted, then these people then carry that content into their networks, and these networks then overlap. So the answer then, I want to say, right, one way to look at it, and I think this is particularly applicable to public diplomacy, and I'm thinking of it from the position of the fact that you have actors for public diplomacy, you have actors above the level of the nation state and below the level of the nation state, who try to engage in this kind of relationship building, is that complex narratives can actually be spread on social media, but really through engaging this embodied form of credibility, right? So that we know somebody is an important actor in this community and they are talking about this. So I believe that this is something that I need to be able to engage.
Wow. Thank you, Shobha, for building on the SISLA's element of education as a first point, awareness building, bringing the time component, which is very interesting, what we can do now and where we need the time. Now we can put some regulation in place. You also brought this extremely important issue of making a digital world a bit more analog, not digital, by having complexity preserved, and diplomacy thrives on this analog aspect of different shades of gray or whatever. And that's so vital. And your argument is that can be kept, complex arguments, through engagement. And we have really rich toolkit or Swiss knife of public diplomacy and algorithms. Let's hear from Damien what he would add to this toolkit in making, and then Cornelio bringing it in the more final shape. Damien.
Thanks, Jovan. Yeah, a few things that diplomats and governments can do. One kind of like a little but very important thing that I would recommend for diplomats is to seek ways where you can take advantage of the opportunity for social media platforms to be a place where diplomacy can occur without diplomats. And I think this is something that was raised in one of the questions earlier on. So I'm going to give you a little example of what this can look like. And this is from the US Embassy in Mexico City, which posted these little videos, again, very practical and useful for people, so therefore highly engaged with. These videos were instructions on how to apply for certain visa types. What happened in the comments, in Spanish, obviously, being from Mexico, is that people started talking about their experiences in applying for these certain visa types and asking questions. And then sometimes the diplomats would respond, but more oftenly what happened is other people who had had similar experiences or different experiences would start commenting on those. So there was a whole thread where there was a discussion that went on between people about how to do something very practical. And that was a great opportunity where the platform gave an opportunity for people to discuss something that was, in this case, a consular matter, but in other cases can be matters of national identity and other diplomatic issues. So I guess what I'd recommend is, wherever possible, don't be too afraid of people going off topic or taking social media platforms in a different direction to what may be initially intended. There are obvious caveats to that because things can get out of hand. Now, the second thing I'd say for governments to do, and there's two things. One I'll be real quick about, and that is that we have talked a bit about in the news as well as in our discussion. There's been a lot of rightful concern about how public discussions on social media can get overheated, over-emotional. Hate can outweigh other forms of discussion. We don't need to go too far at all to see the kind of like vile cesspit that social media discussions can become. What's very important for governments is that they do not lead those discussions. Our political leaders can sometimes be as responsible as anyone else for encouraging those discussions to take place. And that's a tough call for some of us to make, but we should be aware that it is oftentimes a political leader, and we don't need to name any, who really can pour petrol onto this fire of these vitriolic online discussions. And the last thing, Shobha mentioned the influence and the power of the tech companies. Most of them that we're talking about are American-based. They are facing all forms of regulation in the United States. They are also facing forms of regulation in the EU, of which many of you must be aware. The only way I can see that some of the more problematic aspects of social media, including the access to and use of our personal data, and also at the same time denying us the right to know what data they have and how they're using it, the only way I can see of that being addressed is through international cooperation and pressure on, eventually it'll have to end up being in lawmaking, probably in the United States initially, supported by other forms of regulation. The EU is leading that. The rest of the world needs to support that, notwithstanding the very important acknowledgement that, as you said, technology is not seen as the problem in this part of the world, in Asia, as it is in Europe and the United States. So there has to be regulation that takes into consideration kind of like European and North American concerns about privacy, and maybe kind of like Southeast Asian concerns, or certainly in certain countries, about the preservation of free speech online and the facility for political opposition and activism to continue online.
Thank you, Damien, for bringing this systemic aspect. We can do a lot on the individual level, but also there are systemic international aspects which require international cooperation. Now, before I pass floor to Corneliu, let me just read a few questions that you may reflect later on quickly, since we have this event is supported by Switzerland, and when we have to observe the time correctly, we have 5 minutes more. Now, the questions are from Katerina. What are difference between the consumers, users, how it's shaped, and citizens? Are we seen today as consumers of social media, users of citizens? And that's a conceptual issue. And Francis Yana Rosario, question of different patterns and context in which patterns exist. A bit complex that require a lot of discussion. But keep in mind, you will receive, all of you, follow-up links to different studies that were mentioned today, and it is a start of the long journey that we'll have to have ahead of us to discuss these issues. Corneliu, how would you put all of these pieces together and make a nice Swiss knife? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jovan. I've been looking at the Swiss knife and trying to understand exactly these different dimensions that we discussed before. So it's the question of speed that I mentioned at the beginning, the question of emotional framing, the question that was raised right before by Shoba on the question of the lack of complexity, the shallowness of the conversation that it happens online. There is a reason for that. What Damien also mentioned, the fact that we have not a one-to-one conversation, we have many-to-many conversation on the digital media. Sisla also raised this point quite clearly. So what this comes together, and probably this is a word that I think it is probably particularly relevant in this context, is that it's volatility. Volatility in terms of conversation, volatility in terms of the digital public. If I look now at my Twitter feed, the #1 trending is Philadelphia. I haven't checked the news, but this is the one. In your part might be something different, but if you try to remember what was the trending topic yesterday or 2 days ago, you don't remember. The conversation has changed, and for diplomats, this is important. How to navigate into a context that is characterized by speed, by emotion, by a shallowness of the conversation, not complex stories. Nobody pays attention to complex stories, and to the fact that you have no control. There's many to many. So when I was looking at different successful digital ambassadors, there was one feature that struck me as a response to this kind of conversation, what is called authenticity. Authenticity meaning that is not only about what you talk, but also about your digital persona, how people are going to identify you, what kind of association you create about you. So I look, for instance, Dave Sharma in Australia, former ambassador of Australia to Israel, but also to a few others, and I'm sure there are many examples. And each of them has something unique. There is no universal formula that you should do this in order to be remembered. It's something that comes from your personality. But what is important for the public to see, this is not phony, this is not fake, this is not something that you try to use to manipulate, but it's something that coincides with the way in which you communicate. And there are different examples in which sometimes because they have an academic background, some of the ambassadors, they use that as a way to communicate and to develop a digital persona. Others use that more informal aspect. Think about Ambassador Kent in Argentina. So there are different ways, but the word that strikes me as a way to conceptual anchor to be able to navigate into this kind of volatile medium, it's authenticity. So I don't want to take too much time because it's 1 minute left, but this is what I wanted to bring home. How important, despite all these constraints that we have, how important has become now authenticity as a way to stand up and to be identified and to be identified as an ambassador, as an embassy, and create this kind of long-standing impression in a volatile medium.
Thank you, Cornelio. There is good news. I probably read before my morning coffee, but I thought that our session lasts 1 hour. I just heard that we have half an hour more. Therefore, it's a great news, but it made us in a way unintentionally, and it's the best example of the black swan and unintentional consequences to have such a great exchange. And there are so many topics and issues that we open, and it will be now time to shift more towards really audience, which based on the question, it has a lot of experience and expertise. But what you brought, Cornelio, is extremely important, is this question of authenticity, which dovetail nicely with the question of engagement, which was mentioned by Shoba. Authenticity and engagements are the building blocks. Therefore, our Swiss knife of public diplomacy and algorithm is becoming rich and powerful. Let me just move to Tricia to see what's going on in our discussion space. And we have an extra half an hour brought by my misperception this morning, early morning, before I had my morning coffee. Over to you, Tricia.
Thank you. So we have quite a lot of interesting questions from our audience, and I'll read some of them. So first is from Paul Edmar Siago. He asked, do you think artificial intelligence can be used in diplomatic dialogue? And another question from Ekaterina Galakyanova from Moscow, Russia is, why is it so difficult to raise the issue of ethics when talking about the impact of, big data companies? We will not name them, but you know who they are. And next is from Siriporn from Thailand. How can government agencies educate the netizens about the appropriate use of social media in the context of ethics? Another one from Heinrich Hube from Germany. He's an alumnus of the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training. He says, social media work well for polarizing populist positions, but ours are rather the opposite. How do we deal with this dilemma? And lastly, from Patamon, also from Thailand, is there a way to design algorithms to prevent misinformation and fake news? So over to you again, Jovan. Thank you.
Great question, Tricia. In addition to 3 previous questions, is there a future for diplomatic profession, and how to distinguish users, consumers, and the citizens, our 3 different roles. Now, let me read the questions again, summarize, and ask our panelists to pick one of these questions and answer them. The question, how the social media can support diplomatic dialogue, and I guess also mediation. Why we don't use more ethics? I see Shoba probably could be something for you. How we can educate our citizens on the netizens on ethics. The question of polarization and the social media and polarization. Therefore, please pick up who is going to be the first to start answering the question or comments from the audience. Over to you. Shoba, would you like to start on ethics? Cornelio, how do you feel? Cornelio, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can start if you, but so on the question of how social media can facilitate communication, especially with an eye to public diplomacy, I think there are 2 schools of thought. One is the one that tries to pay attention to, in short term, following trends, all kinds of things, and then try to respond. I don't think this is working well. for the reason that we discussed before. What I see nowadays doing better, there are two things, and I have some good examples that I can. One is instead of focusing on short term, which is inevitably problematic because of the volatility of the conversation. What is trendy as we speak now in 2 hours is already outdated. So instead of doing that, and given the speed in which information circulates, what I've seen is lamination. Lamination meaning what? It's not only one message that you put out there and hope for the best. You have the same message that is being laminated with different type of nuances. An example that I have, and I think it worked pretty well during the pandemic, is the wash hands campaign. It's one thing when you put this kind of message, another thing when you bring different personalities and do the same thing. The message was the same, but the personalities, whether it was the UN Secretary General or the President of the European Commission, so that I think it was an example of how a message that is being repeated but with different nuances can actually have a more effective impact. And the second element that I think it's important when we do this kind of engagement on public diplomacy, again, with an eye to overcoming volatility and creating, it's the role, which I found quite interesting, how much storytelling and narratives have become critical. So on one hand, you have volatility that encourages you to be, in the moment. On the other hand, narrative tell a bigger story. A narrative, what means a narrative? Narrative means there are certain protagonists, there's a particular stage, there is a particular drama, a resolution of the drama that comes. And I think there are a number of campaigns that started to look into this role of, again, using an example from the pandemic of a campaign that I found particular, I've been monitoring, it's a NATO narrative, the solidarity narrative, which was particularly useful, right? In the sense that many countries, NATO is a military organization, it shouldn't get involved into that. But it wanted to show that, in times of need, there was a particular situation, member states were in distress, and NATO came to the rescue by delivering protective equipment and so on and so forth. And we can trace that, on digital. And I think that the message that was there, solidarity, captured well, and it created, what I said before, it attached something to NATO as a collective entity, this idea of solidarity, speaking about digital persona, speaking about ways in which you create association with yourself in the long term. So my point is, just to summarize, if you want to do successful public diplomacy, volatility is the one thing that you may want to stay away from, and to think more medium term and long term. And this kind of example that I mentioned, laminations and narratives, I think are gaining, increasing their relevance, or quite successful.
Thank you, Corneliu, for enriching also the conceptual toolkit with lamination. From Shoba, we heard concept of network solidarity, which came from this project that we are getting more and more. Behind me, I have a so-called Gardner curve, which always helps to put what you, Corneliu, mentioned, the question in the time framework. We have, let's say, blockchain 3 or 4 years ago, and suddenly almost disappearing from the public discourse. And what is the point where we can walk this bridge between hype and the plate of productivity? And I think this was resonating from Cornelius Shoba message, this time component, and think in the bit longer perspective. Now, Shoba, to a few questions that somehow land on your table nicely, like a question, why is it so difficult to raise the issues of ethics, data collection, and the others, I guess, mainly with Facebook, Google, and Amazon? We have so many ethical codes. We counted it in one of Diplo research, 400 ethical codes. What is happening? We discuss it a lot. People are aware, but it is not trickling down into the operation and activities. What can be done?
So I think that the one word that can summarize the answer as to why it is so hard to hold corporations like Facebook and so on to a standard of ethics is power, right? This is the one word that I think. So what we are asking them to do is for them to find a motive to actually subject themselves to these ethical codes, right? Because if profit is what is driving you, rather than say public accountability, because tech corporations are not elected into office. They are not actually accountable to anybody except their shareholders, right? So the idea of who has the power then to force or to move these companies towards actually, building ethical standards into their operations is something that, it can't really be answered. I think the answer is nobody. So governments try, especially in this whole thing against fake news and so on. So many countries have tried to come up with regulations about it. But ultimately, I think this question of ethics is the other reason why I think it's hard to hold them accountable is because the question of ethics is not like a technical code that you can produce and then say, okay, please have a compliance officer within your company in order to enforce this code of ethics. Ethics, as I have said just now, most theorists will agree that ethics is something that's very contextual. So you have to have people who have that intellectual ability and stamina to hold that conversation. And we have a public that doesn't always have this intellectual stamina to hold such corporations accountable. Sisla mentioned just now the idea of convenience, right? So when the idea of convenience and the idea of efficiency becomes paramount, and that becomes more important to most people, then ethics tends to take a backseat. And if you have a corporation which is profit motivated, people are still signing up to use your service. People are still willingly giving you all their data because of the convenience that you provide them. Where is the incentive to then take a step back and think about ethics?
Thank you, Shobha.
Yeah, sorry,
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the other side of ethics is individual ethics, as in people, users of social media, and their ethical kinds of practices. Because we know that, people also have agency in terms of how they can use some of these platforms. And that's where the whole dialogue and discourse around media literacy comes in. Unfortunately, it's not always done in a way that helps to empower people with the kinds of tools that they may need. Most of the time, it's a protectionist, be careful about what you post online kind of thing. So I think that educating citizens is something that actually is going to require a lot more thought than most places give to that question.
Quick response from Cornelio, and then we will make a few threads that you introduced that reinforced from previous comments with other speakers. Cornelio, please go ahead.
I think Shobha is perfectly right in terms of the reason why ethics is so problematic, because of the profit, the motivation, and also the constraints that come with that. I also want to warn about, or to caution people about what ethics could mean. There are different attempts at this at the moment to try to introduce regulation. And one, speaking about unintended consequences, is this rise of a new concept, which I found, let's say at the moment quite problematic. Is the idea of digital sovereignty, meaning that if we cannot achieve global cooperation, I'm going alone. Going alone meaning me, country X or Y or so on. I'm going to set up regulation for myself. I'm going to create digital borders, and I'm not going to allow anyone to look or to transmit information that I don't like. It's sort of internet balkanization that people have been talking for years, and it's not, it's happening, right? We see China has its own digital ecosystem. Russia already developed or moving in that direction. Iran the same. So there is something to find a way in which we still keep what we have, that kind of global interconnection, and how this idea of digital sovereignty, which is gaining momentum, can be reconciled with exactly the issues that Shoba mentioned. Can we still keep what we have, but at the same time to clean up social media? Or if not, then, are we going to have digital borders?
Is the key dilemma, and will come now. I think Damien started this thread of discussion of international cooperation as a broader framework, and you brought digital sovereignty, Corneliu, convenience and efficiency dilemma. Shoba, you're probably aware of the current discussion that there is so-called ethics washing by companies basically talking about ethics, but as you said, their profit and their power doesn't make them moving. One just pointer for our audience and for our discussion: European Union new AI policy is very interesting because they say, okay, we will keep our eye on ethics, but law, traditional law, is based on ethics as well. And let's apply existing laws. And then we discuss ethics later on. Basically, they're saying that's fine that we have so many, to the large extent, corporate sponsored discussion on ethics, but let's apply the law that we exist. Now with risk, what Corneliu said, that it could be just increased digital negative aspects of digital sovereignty. I would stay away from using term Balkanization, because I think Balkan created some great things to the history, including Nikola Tesla, who created the electronic space. But Corneliu and I will discuss it later on, since we originate from the region. And that's really, we have nice segue to the one question before Damien, you reflect on this broader context. Can we regulate companies? To what extent? Cisla, there was a question. Is there a way to design algorithm to prevent misinformation and fake news? So-called to have the responsible ethics and AI by design, not by regulation, by technical design. What are the chances for something like this?
I think it's a very noble thought, and I think there is a possibility behind this. And I'll just give you an example of, the larger tech firms like Facebook's, for example, actually building in AI systems to prevent ethical lapses from happening, right? Pretty much. So in the case of Facebook, for example, they've created a system that they deem fairness flow is what it's called, right? And it actually measures the biases against particular groups of people, or the ability for the AI to really go off tangent in terms of thinking and get into a gray area of recommendations and suggestions. So I think but it kind of borders dangerously on their opinion or view of ethics, right? Taking over the responsibility of state, right? And defining what is are they becoming the arbiters of ethics for their country or the world? And that's one of the challenges and implications that they have to contend with, right? I don't think anymore it's just about lip service, about creating checks and balances for these algorithms. I think a lot of organizations like Facebook, Google, YouTube, all of them are putting measures in place and technologies in place. Getting back to the idea of that fairness flow system, right? Basically, any developer within Facebook can run their code through that system, so it finds if there's any biases in the system itself. One notable example is a developer who used a machine learning algorithm to identify pictures of people in kitchens and identify their roles, what they were doing. And while the algorithm itself wasn't biased, the nature of the data set, so there were a lot of pictures with women in the pictures. So it came to a natural conclusion without being passed through the fairness flow that the place of certain gender within, kind of putting them into certain buckets, right? So after passing it through something like the fairness flow, it eliminated that bias, for example. So I think there's progress to be made, but we need to be mindful in terms of making them the gatekeepers of ethics for society at large.
Cisla, there is some progress, what you mentioned, but is it going to be a finally solution? Can we have a solution which is based on algorithm, or you're a bit skeptical that that it will work on its own? Quick reflection from you.
I think it has to be a dual approach. I think it has to be with the state defining the laws and the parameters around which these algorithms are developed. And I think that dialogue has to continue to happen. We cannot rely purely on algorithms to make those decisions, which is something that these tech companies are not relying on today. But again, I can't read into the strength of future technology, but in terms of the thinking, I think it is a viable solution with the right checks and balances. But I think there needs to be, the government measures in place, just like Singapore has done, to make sure no ethical lines are being crossed. It's a difficult answer to, it's naturally going to have a gray area type of answer, but that's where my thinking is today.
Thank you, Sisla. Now I'm thinking of one innovation. There are so many connecting threads in our discussion. Therefore, for the next interface in this meeting, we should have a drawing between arguments which Shoba mentioned and Sisla developed later on and Corneliu build on. That could be some sort of mind map between our images showing this thread of discussion. Damien, there are two threads in your comments. One is a question that we were asked. Social media work well for polarizing populist position, but ours are rather the opposite. How do we deal with this dilemma? That's quick answer on that, and you already started developing these thoughts. And the second question, which will be later on, also for probably one of the concluding remarks, is this question of the broader framework which Corneliu brought, and we sometimes forget that even in very polarized discussion in the United States, one of the common points for both Biden and Trump is a need to curb the power of the social media companies and to regulate them through Article 230. Quick answer on this question of polarization and also short reflection on the regulatory challenges before we move into the concluding remarks.
Sure, I'll be real quick with that question on polarization. I agree that a lot of the time diplomats are trying to do something opposite, so therefore don't use social media to do those types of longer, more complicated, more discursive, more negotiated types of discussions. Social media is not the place for that, all right? There are many other ways that we can still interact with one another. It may be a place where you can kind of like support it, or certain efforts that are being attempted can be, but as Corneliu has mentioned, quickness, emotion, strong narratives, that's what social media is good at. Long, lengthy negotiations or discussions, do it some other way. The other point about the possibility of international regulation, I just want to pull up that thread that Shoba mentioned about power. There's two aspects to social media tech companies' power that we should reflect on. One is their commercial power, which we've talked about a lot. The second one is their ideological power. And this is where, I guess, instead of talking about ethics, I'm going to use a kind of like a more American term, which is values, and how these companies align strongly with these sets of US values, which have made their way into American legislation. And specifically, it's called the Communication Decency Act of 1996, which means that no website is held responsible for the content that someone else puts on there. And up until very recently, that there was very little that would very few exceptions to that. Recently, there has been one which suggests that there may be technological opportunities to track certain types of content. You are now no longer able to use websites like the social media sites, but also a classified ads page to traffic sex work. All right, and the tech companies actually fought hard against that, but they were finally regulated so that they're no longer people are no longer able to do that. It suggests that there is a chink in their armor. And as you mentioned before, both Biden and Trump and many others are talking about curbing the power of those tech companies for very different reasons in America. But we are in a very interesting position in history where I think we are going to see those companies have to change the way that they operate, either because they know regulation is going to come and they want to preempt it, or they're going to be forced into it. The question will then become, how do attempts to regulate speech in order to get rid of things like misinformation and fake news, how does that not turn into a system which prevents other forms of undesirable information from being shared. And undesirable information may be, in fact, information being shared by human rights activists, political opponents, and those sorts of things. That's a super difficult problem to solve.
Thank you, Damien. And just information for our audience, as we are discussing here, there is an Internet Governance Forum, the main gathering discussing digital policy globally, hosted by the United Nations. And in the follow-up to our discussion, we will send some pointers for this, let's say, systemic framework, which is coming clearly as a major challenge. How to curb this power of social media companies and how to make them constructive participants in the society. And Damien, you mentioned one interesting point. We may not use Twitter in some situations if we want real dialogue or mediation or a quality dialogue and understanding, and that's a relevant point. It was mentioned with a few speakers that sometimes we have to switch off social media if the context doesn't allow it. Now we move to the last, we got relaxed with the time, which is good, but we move to the last leg of our discussion. And I would like to invite our panelists to reflect to the question, what are the opportunities of data-driven algorithm for public diplomacy and discourse? One opportunity, as specific as it is possible, and for the concluding remarks, and we will start with Shoba, move to Corneliu, Damian, and conclude with Sisla. Over to you, Shoba.
So if we're thinking about, thank you, Jovan. If we're thinking about a specific point, you know, about how social media can be used perhaps positively, you know, to encourage, enhance public discourse, I wouldn't give up on it entirely, because I think that is in some ways an illusion, right? What we have right now is massive. So even if you think about Twitter, I don't know that I would entirely agree that Twitter is not the place to have complex conversations, because a lot of it is how it has been managed. So if you look at the way in which Twitter has evolved, we call these affordances, right? The affordances that have emerged from Twitter. Some of them actually evolve from how it is that users are using the platform, and then they get built in to the platform, right? So one example is the idea of having a tweet thread. So a lot of scholars, public intellectuals, and activists have found that they can really engage and educate the public on a lot of issues by actually having their tweets together in a kind of connected series. So, you know, replying to their own tweets one after the other, so that they can actually then evolve a complete kind of map. And so this has then been built in, because in an update, then what Twitter did was introduce the idea that you didn't have to post your tweet immediately. You could add more tweets to it and then post it. You know, I actually think this is a fantastic example of how users can also, through their collective kind of action, have an impact on the sort of affordances available to them. You know, and
Shoba, some sort of haiku public diplomacy. And
I love that idea.
Okay, thank you. Let's move. I know we can reflect quite a bit over. Let's move for your one quick idea, Corneliu. What would be your suggestion and on this point?
Thank you. And I think it relates also to this question that was raised at the beginning about the role of artificial intelligence at the moment in facilitating diplomatic dialogue. And I think what I've seen in the recent months, in the context of the pandemic, but also of the unfolding economic crisis associated with the pandemic in various parts of the world, is an attempt to try to think about how to deal with the negative side, with the dark side. It's a very complex issue. What I mean by this is that you have this kind of conspiracy thinking that affects public health messages, that erodes social trust and trust in our public authorities. And the question was, to what extent we can use these kind of sophisticated tools to anticipate, right? Not only to debunk stuff when it's already viral and it's too late, but to anticipate when certain things can become toxic. I say this is a complex because it involves deep ethical questions. You can imagine this kind of tool being used for good. You can imagine the same tool used by authoritarian leaders to stifle any type of criticism or political criticism. So this is something that I think I heard institutions looking seriously at it. As I said, like technology I was seeing with social media could push in the direction that can clean up and can assist a little bit this effort, this tremendous, in this particular difficult period, with all the anxiety that generates this conspiracy thinking, but at the same time, in the wrong hands, it can enhance the appeal and the power of authoritarian regimes.
Thank you, Cornelio. We have haiku public diplomacy. We have a responsible anticipation. What is the keyword, Damian, from you? And we are already slightly over time. Please give us the tweet or underlying suggestion, and then we'll close with Isla.
Yeah, one word that I'd like to underscore is the potential for listening. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how to talk, but we maybe haven't talked enough about how to listen. One thing that we can all do, if we want to find out what people in another part of the world or in a certain group or at a certain location, if we want to know what they are thinking or talking about, that data is available there on social media or sometimes through like search data about what people are searching for and so forth. If you want to understand what people are thinking about you, go and see what they're doing online.
Great. Listening, adding to the haiku anticipation listening. Sisla, what is the keyword from your side?
I think for me it would be collaboration. Perhaps just in the sense that moving forward with this data-driven, idea of public diplomacy, it's going to be a collaborative process between those who have the expertise in these domains and those with the generational diplomats who have this information and the ambassadors and the states themselves. So I think collaboration between these two domains will lead to positive outcomes. And I'm very excited to the future of these algorithms and their usage in meaningful ways.
Thank you. With these 4 keywords, we'll wrap up discussion, very rich discussion with the haiku, anticipation, listening, and the collaboration. And I hope you are as filled with the joy and the curiosity as I am after this 90 minutes discussion. And one of the lessons is, if you provide people with time, they will fill this additional time, as we did in very constructive way. I would like to thank, before I pass the floor to Tricia, great questions from the audience. We answered some of them, but we will answer all questions in follow-up. And I'm sure that ASEF will send follow-up links to all concepts that were mentioned during discussion and additional materials. We started with the metaphor of the cooking the nice meal, fast food or slow food, that it moved more towards the slow food. And we also started with the notion of journey, and it was a great learning journey. I would like to thank Shoba, Cornelio, Daniel, Sisla for making this such a rich and engaging discussion, and Tricia too, and ASEF for organizing it. And I'm passing the floor back to Tricia. Over to you. We need your sound, Tricia.
Okay, is it good now? Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next year when we launch another series of the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training webinars. So that's it from us, and we hope that you've learned as much as we did. So thank you to our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Jovan, for excellently moderating the panel. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.